I'm happy to introduce Eddie Sarfaty, stand-up comedian turned writer whose new book, Mental, he'll be reading briefly from and talking about today. He effortlessly captures the everyday absurdities of life, blending self-deprecation and sarcasm, which I'm sure we all will appreciate. His autobiographical essays touch on career lows, cheapskate exes, the wonder and hell of family, psychopathic cats, and so much more. That just sounds funny, describing it. So without further ado, Eddie Sarfaty.
Hi, thanks for coming today on your lunch hour to the Google Author Series. As Heath said, I am a stand-up comic. I've been working as a stand-up comic for the past 9 years full-time. And like a lot of stand-up comics, I've written a book, and a lot of people express sort of concern about that. Like, what's he doing writing a book? He's a stand-up comic. And I wanted to talk a little bit today about how I felt that prepared me to write a book. I certainly, I'm educated enough and can write a sentence clearly enough that I could have attempted to write a book 9 years ago, but I don't think that without my experience of being a stand-up, that it would have been nearly as good and nearly as funny or nearly as smart or poignant or anything that it's turned out to be. And I have to take a little side note and say it's kind of unusual for me to say nice things about myself because I'm a stand-up comic and a neurotic Jew who's completely self-deprecating. So if I'm saying that it's smart and funny and poignant, it's probably smart and funny and poignant. One of the things that I think really was helpful about being a stand-up comic is that it let the book end up sounding like me. Several people have emailed me, called me, told me in person that I read your book and I could hear you saying it. And that was a really huge compliment because, if you can't hear me saying it, I don't know that people are going to get it. And I think that's a hard thing to do because we're not used to writing to be heard. We're used to writing to be read. And stand-up is all, of course, about writing to be heard. And especially when writing a book in the first-person nonfiction voice, I think that's really key. If you're writing a novel or something fictitious or, in an omniscient voice, I guess it's not as important. But writing from your own point of view, it's got to sound like you. One of the things I really feel strongly about in writing comedy, in being a stand-up, was the idea of being an outsider. Now, as I say, I'm a Jew, I'm gay, I was a fat kid growing up, I never felt like I quite fit in, which I think is really kind of important, necessary when doing comedy. Every comic who's successful, who people relate to, is an outsider in some fundamental way. There are a million Jewish comics and African-American comics and women comics and gay comics. There's not a whole lot of heterosexual, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant male comics. And if you're funny-looking, unless they're funny-looking, or they're had some horrible experience, so if you're a heterosexual, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant male with a full bank account and wears a 42 regular, you're probably not a Laugh Riot. And the thing about being an outsider can happen in a bunch of different ways. It can happen culturally, which is why Jews are completely overrepresented in the comedy world. Jews are the ultimate outsiders throughout history. It can happen in your family. You can come from a broken home. You can be personally, being a fat kid was very horrible at the time, but my sense of humor developed as a survival technique, and I think that was really instrumental in helping me create a comic voice. And I think that in America, there's a guy who wrote a book. His name is Ted Cohn, and it's another great book called Jokes. He's a professor at the University of Chicago, and it's a short little book which is filled with great jokes, but it also talks about the function of jokes in American society and how It's this little moment of intimacy that we can all, use to connect with each other when we're all so different from different parts of the world and different cultures and different beliefs. It lets everything else flow away for a minute. And it really is a very cohesive thing in American culture. So I think that being an outsider and being lucky enough to be in the U.S. Has been really helpful to me in figuring out how to connect to people who are very different than me. One of the surprising things about the book is that I've gotten emails from people completely outside of who the audience I thought would be interested in it. I had a letter from a housewife in Virginia who said, I was at the bookstore in the romance section where I always go, and my 14-year-old daughter came bounding over with your book and said, let's get this. And she said, well, what is it? And the daughter said, I don't know, it looks silly. And she said, I never in a million years would have picked it up, but I looked at it and I picked it up, and it really made her laugh and made her think outside of her own experience. And so that was a really rewarding thing. One of the other things about doing stand-up in preparation for writing a book was that it enabled me to figure out who I was. You'll see stand-up comics often say, oh, it took me 10 years to find my voice. And I think that part of that's getting older. You become more yourself as you get older. You become more the person you're meant to be. And a lot of people attempt stand-up comedy with an idea of what they're going to be. People come in saying, I'm going to be the neurotic Jew, or I'm going to be the angry young man, or I'm going to be the put-upon housewife. And all those things are fine, and they may be part of who you are. But it's kind of like decorating a house, and you say, I'm going to have a house that's decorated in French country, and then you go out and buy all the right things, and you end up with a house that's a beautiful house that looks like every other house that's decorated that way. Whereas if you just went out and bought the things that you thought were attractive, interesting, funny, smart, pretty, then at the end of 10 years or however, you have a house that says you. I think stand-up comedy is kind of like that. So you have to not be afraid to just do what you think is funny and not try to be something else. Because you'll get people who try to be the next Roseanne Barr, or try to be the next Joan Rivers, or the next Richard Pryor or Henny Youngman, and I think it doesn't work. I think it just makes you generic, because if you try to be everything, you're nothing. And if you're not, you have to be something specific, which is something else about stand-up comedy that I think helped me write this book, which is specificity. People get up and do stand-up comedy and just think that they're going to talk. You get a lot of people who do stand-up comedy who are hysterical at the water cooler, or the class clown, or the life of the cocktail party, and they are. And certainly, if you are that person, that's great. And I've been that person and loved those people. But you're operating you have a head start in those situations, because more often than not, you're saying something funny in response to something that someone's just said, or something that's just happened, or is based upon you having some shared information. And when you're a comic, you don't have that. I don't know any of you. Your lives could be so different from mine, and I have to figure out how to connect to you quickly and specifically. So the thing is, the specificity, I'm getting a little lost here myself, so please bear with me. Writing a joke is kind of like writing a poem. People think you just get up and talk, and it's not. It's very specific. When you write a poem, if you read a Shakespeare sonnet, every word is chosen specifically for the sound, for the emotional content, for the number of syllables, it's all very, very carefully planned. And I believe, and probably there are people who disagree with me, that a joke should be the same way. I mean, if you can say something effectively in 10 words, don't say it in 12. Pick the words specifically. The the trick of stand-up is making it seem like it's effortless, but there's so many machinations that go into the structure of the joke. I mean, hiding the machinery, I think, is really the art of joke telling. So all of those things were really helpful to me in writing the book. I think a couple of things that were also helpful were learning how to tell a story with immediacy. You know, if you're doing stand-up comedy, you can't be as effective if you tell things in the past tense. No matter what you say, I always recommend put it in the present. If I'm telling, of course, we know that what happened on the subway this afternoon happened 6 hours ago or whatever. But if I start the sentence, so I'm on the subway, rather than I was on the subway, everyone's right with you, it's right there, it's immediate. And 9 out of the 10 short stories in the book are written in the present tense. And also, I think one of the other things that was helpful was to make it be about me, which sounds kind of narcissistic, but it's more interesting for me to talk about my point of view rather than try to guess other people's, because mine can be specific and I don't know what theirs is necessarily. So in terms of writing, you know, all of that, all of the exercises in writing stand-up comedy really helped me write the book because I learned how to be specific. I don't think that without that I would have taken the care to choose just the right words in so many places that I did. The other thing is that in stand-up, you have to know your audience, or at least be able to read them. You know, being an openly gay comic, there's definitely jokes I'm not going to tell if it's a mixed or straight crowd, just because they wouldn't get it. That doesn't mean I'm going to closet myself. There's definitely things that I wouldn't tell an audience where there are no Jews, because they're not going to get it. And again, it doesn't mean that I pretend not to be Jewish or totally ignore it. One of the freeing things I found about writing the book was there was no audience sitting there. And I didn't really have to worry about that. And I thought, and it's good, because if I did worry about that, I think it would have hindered me being me, and, you know, worrying about, will the book sell, or who's going to read it, are people going to like it? And quite frankly, my big goal with the book was, you know, just to have it not suck. That was the only goal that I could make myself live with. Otherwise, I would have been freaking out every day trying to write it. The other thing is, you know, we've all heard brevity is the soul of wit, and that's very true. You know, I teach a comedy workshop, and people come in with a joke. It's a great idea, but it's, you know, 50 words before it gets to the punchline. And basically, one of the keys to humor is that the impact of the punchline is inversely proportional to the length of the setup. If it takes you 50 words to get to the punchline, you probably lost your audience, and it's hard to get them back. Or you better have a really great punchline if it's 50 words to get there. The other thing that I think people don't talk about a lot in comedy is an emotional component. You know, you can be smart. I think you have to be somewhat smart to be a decent comic. And I'm not saying necessarily educated or book smart, but you have to have some kind of intuitive sense of people and an awareness of the absurdity of things in general, and hopefully of yourself. But if there's no emotional component in what you're talking about, you're clever at best. You can't really be funny. You can't really connect with people in that intimate way, which I think is really important. And you can, I'm fine with clever. I love clever. I love bad puns. I love silliness. But at the end of the day, a 300-page book of just that is kind of a snore. So, and that also requires you being able to be willing to mock yourself and to expose things that maybe aren't so pretty. And I think that that's really the gift of humor, is that it lets you get through things that are difficult and horrible. I mean, I've had hard times in my life. I've talked about them in the book. The book covers, my struggles with depression, bad relationships, my father's illness, just money problems and drug use and all these other things. And quite frankly, if I hadn't had a sense of humor, I don't know that I could have gotten through any of that. If there's anything that's so completely horrible that I can't find something to laugh about it, I really don't want to know what that is. And this book was really, has been really well received, I think, because I was willing to do that. And that brings me to sort of the idea of fearlessness. One of the things about learning to be funny, people say, can you learn to be funny? And as I said, some people are funny at the office or in the classroom. People say, can you learn to be funny? Can you learn to do stand-up comedy? Can you learn to be funny? And you can learn to put things in the right form for it. I think it's hard to be funny if you're not funny. But learning to be funny in a way that connects to people requires a kind of fearlessness. I mean, stand-up comedy is hard. They say in all the polls that public speaking is the worst fear that people have. It's worse than snakes or drowning or plane crashes or anything. And stand-up comedy is public speaking made 100 times more terrifying. And so you have to go up there with the willingness to be completely disliked and to make a complete fool of yourself. And that's, a little bit of bravery that a lot of people can't seem to muster. Although I do have to say, it's one of the things, like most things that people are afraid of, that's, more terrifying in theory. Because the big fear is you'll get up there, you'll tell a joke, and people won't laugh. It'll be horrible. And the worst thing that ever really happens is that you get up there, you tell a joke, no one laughs, and it's horrible. And then, okay, it's horrible, it's over, you're still alive, you're still in one piece, and it's not as bad as you thought it was going to be. And I think one of the things about stand-up is that you really have to be willing to know that 95% of everything you do is going to suck. And I think that's true, particularly true of comedy. I think it's true of all creative endeavors. I mean, people make bad paintings, people write bad books, people make bad movies, all kinds of stuff. But once you get past the fact that 95% of everything you do is going to suck, you're okay. Because then when it sucks, it's to be expected. In college, I was very fortunate to take an acting class with a woman named Nancy Marchand, who was a wonderful actress on Broadway, who also played the grandmother in The Sopranos. And she said something one time about how, as an actor, you can't expect the audience to suspend their disbelief unless you can suspend your shame. Meaning just that. And I think that's true of any art form. You can't worry. You can't hold back. You can't be afraid and expect people to connect to you. I think that's been so important with comedy and so important with the writing. This is a really serious lecture for a comedy book, isn't it? But the point is, comedy is a serious business. The torture and the agony and the self-doubt and everything that goes into every joke, is there. It's just hiding the machinery and having the joke come out and people think it's effortless. That's really the art. Now, one of the things about stand-up versus the book, which I liked more about the book, was that stand-up, you fail immediately. You tell a joke, it bombs, and you have to address it. Everyone in the room is uncomfortable. Hopefully it's one joke and not the entire set, because that's the worst. And with the book, it was kind of nice not to have to worry about that. Oh, I think this is funny. Oh yeah, it looks funny. I've reworked it. I can move on. And then it grew actually to reverse where, a joke bombs, it's over. The audience in the room didn't like the joke. Maybe the next audience will. The world doesn't think you suck. Whereas, you write a bad book, it's kind of permanent. It's out there. My big fear was that I would walk down the street and people would be like, oh, there's that guy, Eddie. Oh, he wrote that horrible book. Or see it in the clearance bin in every store that I passed. And so I really, I was glad I had the fearlessness, or the erratic fearlessness. I'm not saying there are times when I'm terrified, but the erratic fearlessness of stand-up when writing the book, because otherwise it would have been completely overwhelming. I guess one of the other things I want to talk about is, writing comedy is sort of luck, sort of, you want to be wary of who's in your audience, but you can't really change who you are completely. And you have to just sort of hope that someone's going to connect to you. You can't, I don't think you can be a good comic and be dishonest. I can't pretend to be some straight waspy guy and, who doesn't have depression, who didn't go through what he went through. With writing the book, I just had to hope people would find it, that it would click with someone. And luckily it has, but I was sort of prepared for it not to happen. And so it's been a really good prep for writing the book, I have to say. And I'll tell you a little bit about the book. The book is 10 short stories, autobiographical, humorous, yet also smart and poignant, as I said. Range from everything, adopting the world's worst shelter cat in my quest for unconditional love from an animal, having the biggest cheapskate in the world as a boyfriend. I took my parents on a trip to London and Paris for their anniversary when my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, which was really my favorite story in the book, and I think quite poignant because a lot of people deal with that. It was very accessible to everyone. I talk about having my heart broken, going online dating going online screwing actually for a period of months to try and drown my sorrows and the craziness that happens there. Luckily, my mother was online dating at the same time, which was kind of a trip. The other stories include I had the good fortune, in retrospect, the misfortune I thought at the time, to work at a upscale gentleman's bar on the Upper East Side, which was filled with men in their 60s who were bitter, drunk, old, nasty queens. And I thought, and as a 20-something gay guy, I was like, oh, is this the future? I'm out of here, And it really made me be able to see that, everyone's struggling, everyone's trying, everyone's got something, fantastic about them. Everyone has a story that would break your heart. Everyone has a reason for who they are, and it's fascinating. And it made me, I think, be more aware of my own level of sympathy, my own level of judgmentalness. So those are some of the things that I cover in the book. I talk about, I was talking about my depression, about I was also unfortunate enough to be the company manager for an ill-fated Portuguese production of Phantom of the Opera, which was by far the worst experience of my adult life, and ended calamitously in a Lisbon emergency room. But, comedy is born of pain, and it made me stronger. I think that that covers a little bit about what the book is about, and what inspired me to write it and what prepared me to write it. And I guess you guys have some questions about it. we can talk about that. Thanks for participating. That's really helpful. Hi.
Hi. I was interested to hear you to talk about stand-up in terms of writing jokes, because I've actually heard other stand-up comics say very specifically that they don't write jokes, they don't tell jokes.
What do they do?
I think their point was that what they're doing is more, situational stories that are funny rather than jokes as such. And I wonder if that distinction, I kind of wondered if if you were getting at that with your comment about hiding the machinery. I'd like to know a little bit more what you mean by that.
I think that, as I said, I really do believe that the impact of the punchline is inversely proportional to the length of the setup. And that if you have a joke and you're taking a paragraph to get to the punchline's kind of diluted. Unless, of course, your paragraph is peppered with other jokes. Then it's a series of jokes. It's not. I think storytelling is a great thing. I wish that the American tradition of storytelling was more widespread than it is, because there are wonderful places like the Moth here in New York and Speakeasy in DC, where people tell wonderful stories. Some of them are comedic. Some of them are certainly not. People have a different definition of what they term a joke. A priest, a minister, and a rabbi go into a bar. That's like, people think that's a joke, or a knock-knock joke, or people think that jokes aren't serious, that they're not, that there's no depth to them. And I dispute that. I think a real joke has to have an emotional component. And I love a joke that draws you in because of the emotion and then twists at the end. A joke I tell is about my boyfriend. He was from this Christian right family in Idaho, and his parents couldn't deal with the gay issue. They couldn't deal with sexual issues at all. When he was 12 years old, his mother caught him masturbating, and she was so stressed about it that she smacked him so hard that she knocked him out of their pew. Now that's a joke that has emotional content to it, because people understand that. People under the stress of dealing with a child's sexuality. It's something no one's comfortable with, acknowledging that children are sexual beings, and then it twists at the end. So it gets people to think about the subject, but also makes it safe because it's absurd. So I like jokes. I think jokes are, as I said, a wonderful American vehicle to connect with people and relieve stress. And in our culture, in our multicultural world, there's a lot of stress. Thanks. Anybody else? Please.
So, something I often wonder about when I listen to a stand-up comic is how much of the persona they're presenting is a character and how much of it is them.
Well, as I said, there are some people, there's a range of what's considered stand-up comedy, and I certainly embrace the range because I think people have different strengths in bringing different things to the stage. Some people are definite characters. Some people, are great mimics. I have a friend who can go from being Joan Rivers to being Robert De Niro to being a Hoover upright in 10 minutes, and it's brilliant. I can't do that. There are some people who've created a persona, like, when Roseanne Barr first started doing that whole domestic goddess thing she did was this persona, but it's based on her. There's got to be some truth in what you're doing. You don't want to see somebody you go see a play if you want to see somebody be somebody different. The thing that fascinates me is that people as versus, Richard Pryor and Henny Youngman and Roseanne Barr can all touch the same audience and connect to the same group of people. If they were all on the same bill, it would be a fantastic night. They're all completely different, and their stories are so different, but they're touching people. For me, the big pleasure about stand-up comedy is that I get to be me. I was a theater major in college. I thought I wanted to be an actor since I was a little kid. And I discovered that it was much more fun to get up and say what I wanted to say, the way I wanted to say it, rather than trying to figure out what the author's intent was and take into consideration the director's point of view and all this stuff. I think that, yeah, I guess that's about it on that. Go further. But I hope you have another question because no one else is talking.
Any other questions? You can probably read a little bit if you wanted to read.
I'd be happy to read. Something short. I'll read the first piece in the book. It's only 4 pages, and this was a story about when I, at 21, told my grandmother that I was gay. And the book, although I'm reading the gay section, is not only gay. There's a lot of stuff for everybody, and people worry, oh, it's a gay book, I can't read it. But, I make my grandmother cry. I come out to her, and her fists close and her eyes fill up, and she's silent for the longest moment. And then, speaking through the tears, she astonishes me. It's that gym where you go, that's where they all are. Her assertion makes me laugh. How could she possibly know that? She's never been to my gym. How could my frail little grandma, a sheltered girl from an Orthodox family, a woman who has barely left the house for the past 30 years, have any kind of insight on the subject? The conversation continues with her becoming progressively more and more upset. She's perched on the upholstered green rocker from JCPenney, a half-finished Afghan in her lap, and I'm sitting Indian style on the wall-to-wall carpet facing her. I'm peripherally aware of my mom and dad listening helplessly to the whole exchange as they pretend to wash dishes in the next room. Though I came out to my parents at college, as a rule, I managed to find a million non-sexual things to talk about when visiting them. A relief, since when I was with my friends, sex was the only thing we ever seemed to talk about. But this time, Granny brings up the issue and continues pressing it until I have no choice but to come clean. She also confesses to having purposely avoided the subject of my sexuality until now, but has finally decided to take the leap. Well, I thought that you were, and I made up my mind I was going to ask you. Well, how do you feel? It's a shock. She sheds more tears, and my soothing accelerates to match her distress. I hand her a Kleenex and I hold her hand. My mother, accustomed to taking charge in a crisis, takes advantage of my grandmother's poor hearing, tiptoes behind her rocker, shakes her head, and mouths to me, "You shouldn't have told her. You shouldn't have told her." It's a big help. With an evil stare, I send her back to the sink and continue my comforting. 2 seconds later, the phone rings. I hear my mother pick it up, and I can tell from her voice it's my brother Jack, who's in grad school in Chicago. I turn my attention back to Granny as my mother calls from the kitchen. Ed, pick up the phone. Annoyed, I yell back, "Not now, for God's sake." And then I hear my mother announcing, as if into a public address system, "He can't come to the phone. He's telling Grandma that he's gay." And so I'm outed to my brother, and I think, okay, one less call to make. I spend the next hour or so quietly seated on the floor and then leave my grandmother to catch the train back to New York and the apartment that I share with 3 other 20-somethings, all gay and in various stages of self-loathing. The incident is constantly on my mind the entire week. It's still on her mind, too, when I call 2 days later. "Hi, Granny, how are you?" "How do you think I am?" Pin drops. What are you doing, watching TV?" "No, I'm just thinking." Crickets. "Well, what are you thinking about?" "What do you think I'm thinking about?" Similar stressful exchanges occur on days 3, 4, and 5. Now, being the youngest, the favorite, and the only one who still lives close enough to visit regularly, I feel a special devotion to my grandmother. Our relationship is one of the most wonderful things in my life. She lived with us while I was growing up, my maturation coinciding with her decline. At the age of 95, although she'll only admit to being 92, her mind is sharp, but her body is brittle. As time passes, I find myself more and more in the role of the adult, keeping her informed, preparing her meals, and helping her into bed. The possibility that the bond between us could be permanently damaged is crippling to me. After almost 2 weeks of tense, awkward phone calls, I again go home for a visit. There's no reference to my revelation, and the day passes far more easily than I expect. It isn't until late at night when it even comes up. I'm tucking Granny in, gently rotating her fragile legs onto the bed while I cradle her back and slowly lower her onto the mattress. As I smooth out the corners, she brings up the subject that we've managed to avoid the entire day. So, you don't like a girl to get married? My body tenses. No. You prefer a boy? I breathe deeply. Yes. She pauses and then says resolutely, well, then that'll be your life and you'll be happy that way. Yes. My tension melts away but returns when she says, but it's not like making love with a girl. What can you do? I see where this is leading, and I try to head it off. Well, Grandma, it's not about sex. It's about who you love and who you care for, but she will not be deterred. Yes, I know that, but it's not like with a girl. What can you do? I dodge the question. She presses. I parry. She asks again. I change the subject. She changes it back. And finally, after the fifth, but what can you do? I blurt out, well, I have 2 hands. So what do you, just jerk each other off? I'm stunned, horrified, and amused all at the same time. Grandma! She laughs to break the tension, but then continues, you know, I hear that some of the boys use the behind. I laugh to break the tension. I toyed with a couple of comebacks. Wow, Grandma, what a great idea. Or, yeah, some of them do. But settle for planting a simple kiss on her forehead and saying good night. Now, after that, our relationship is almost back to normal. She's totally accepting, but it isn't clear how much she understands the specifics of the situation. She knows I'm gay, but appears hopeful whenever I even mention a woman by name. She repeatedly asks my brother, what made him that way? And confides to my mother her worries that I'm destined to become a prostitute. A proposition that, given my precarious finances, occasionally worries me too. My mother, who joined PFLAG, the Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, immediately after I came out, suggests giving my grandmother a copy of Now That You Know, a book that the group recommends and that I cynically refer to as everything you always wanted to know about homosexuality but were afraid to hear. I pick up a copy for my grandmother. 2 weeks later, I'm home for a visit and to do some laundry. I see the book lying on the nightstand. The wrinkled spine and folded corners tell me it's been read. I turn to Granny, who's busily working on yet another Afghan. Hey, Granny, did you read that book? The crochet hook stops. She looks up and says point blank, yes, and it's disgusting. My heart sinks and my guard goes up. Disgusting? Yes, it's disgusting. It says that some of the parents don't love their children anymore. And she makes me cry. Oh, thanks. So that's a little taste. That's the first story in the book. As I told you, it goes on to other things at other points in my life, ranging. That's the story that takes place in 1986, and it goes all the way up to 2006. I guess we're done here. And thank you so much for taking your lunch hour to spend time with me. I appreciate it. And enjoy the book.